After decades of white straight male domination of the screen, the rising discontent of a rapidly growing minority, ongoing feminist movements, and other activist movements, Hollywood has found itself in a rather precarious position. Filmmakers are realizing, rather late, that those of the growing minority in the United States are the ones who buy the majority of movie tickets, and that today, everybody wants and expects to be represented. We have definitely been seeing more diverse casts over the years. According to a study conducted by UCLA, people of color's share of lead roles has nearly tripled, moving it closer to the appropriate representation of 40.2%. But movies don't just show faces, they tell stories. It's in the plot of these films where the true question lies. How are minorities being represented? And are the roles they are given actually answering the demands of millions? Hollywood has always had a fascination with different cultures, venturing to far and sometimes fictional lands. Now, while these films did open up the audience's eyes to a wider world and hired hundreds of minority actors, they were far from being a just representation. Following the tradition of the white savior story, the plot best described by Gordon and Vera's words, the Masonic white self, or sometimes the American or male self, is the redeemer of the weak, the great leader who saves blacks from slavery or oppression, rescues people of color from poverty and disease, or leads Indians in battle for their dignity and survival. The Karate Kid 2010, Avatar 2009, and The Last Samurai 2003 are some good examples for the white savior or the American savior story. Unfortunately, movies such as these often show little understanding or respect for different cultures. In fact, The Karate Kid isn't even about karate, it's about Kung Fu, but Kung Fu Kid doesn't sound as catchy. There are also some cases where stories with originally diverse heroes were whitewashed, like in the film adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where the good guys were played by white people and the bad guys were played by people of color. Another good example is Prince Caspian from the Chronicles of Narnia, where he went from this
You're Narnians. They're supposed to be extinct.
to this once the audience were sure he was a good guy.
Time to fall to fierce temptations. Be strong. Never give in.
On the other side of the spectrum, we find a different telling, the white male oppressor. Now try thinking of a recent movie that stars a black or bisexual character, for example, and that doesn't mention many times or focus on their struggle with the discrimination. Difficult, right? As screenwriter Nikesh Shukla once said, white people think that people of color only have ethnic experiences and not universal experiences. This is the recurring problem with diversity in film today. Now, it's important that we use characters in films to outline social issues, teach our history, and raise awareness. But what I and many others are trying to say is that the role of the oppressed shouldn't be the only role non-white actors can play. Realizing that white savior stories are no longer widely accepted, screenwriters have been trying a new approach, adding or replacing characters. But very rarely does this actually work. A perfect example is Netflix's Letter for the King. This 2019 fantasy series, based on the Dutch classic of the same name by Arthur Tonke Dracht, takes place in a mainly white medieval European-inspired setting. However, Netflix has made some changes. They casted half-Sudanese actor Emir Wilson for the role of Trudy, main lead. They added characters like Iona, who's somehow a 14-year-old girl who becomes a knight and is also Asian. We have two gay side characters, and Lavinia's character is given much more importance, and they even changed the story in a twist, making her the powerful savior rather than Trudy. With Letter for the King being a new fantasy show that also checked off everything on the diversity list, the studio believed to have struck a victory. But then, why did everybody hate it? These are some real audience reviews. The audience doesn't just want to identify with a label, They want a character, someone who has just as important and complex story as his male, white, or straight counterpart. But the screenwriters have sacrificed storyline, character development, and logic all for the sake of labels of diversity. Letter for the King isn't the only production that has suffered this fate. Shows and movies like Doctor Who, Enola Holmes, and Amazon's recent Cinderella have all received similar backlash. Why? Because despite their diverse cast, they fail at actually including their characters into the story. By throwing in a few people of different ethnicities and genders in front of the camera, they claim to have responded to the need for inclusion, but all they are doing is masking the yet unaddressed issue: unequal access to equally important and complex roles. Our differences aren't labels, and they shouldn't be demeaned to mere boxes on a list. No matter how many are checked off, it isn't the easy way out of the diversity problem. There is, however, one very simple solution, an easy recipe for a perfectly diverse film. Make movies about individual people and their universally individual experiences. We don't need 100 films about sexism or racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, or transphobia. We don't need a female version of James Bond or a gay version of Spider-Man. What we need to see is original and diverse stories about people who just happen to be non-straight, non-white, or non-male. Stories where minorities aren't just there for their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, or the history of their ancestors. Stories where they are cast not because they are of a minority, but because they are just as good a fit for the role as any other. That is what true equal representation is.